You began to plant the seed in people's minds. But I think in the process, you did create a media image of me that's far beyond, the reality of me.
And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. It was overwhelming me.
Hello again, and welcome to Serial Killing, a podcast. My name is Elissa Kerrill, and I am the host, writer, editor, all the things. And if you're watching the video episode of this, just understand that I do have to write these things out ahead of time, or it would be a bad time for all of us. So if you see my eyes moving, that's why. They are my words, I assure you. So over here, we talk about all manner of true crime at this point. I've been podcasting for nearly 6 years now, and I am, as of this recording, nearing 500 episodes, which I just wanted to take a moment to be proud of with you guys. This has been sort of a life passion project for me, and I really appreciate you guys sticking with me all this time. Now, if you like what you hear or the particular episode and want to support, you can of course buy me a coffee on Ko-fi, or you can get early access and 0 ads if you join Patreon or subscribe on Spotify. All of that is down in the description of the show. Today's podcast will be on David McGreavy. This one involves children again, so I just want to put that disclaimer out there. Now, David came under my radar as I was working the regular job and listening to crime documentaries on YouTube, and this story just seemed so horrible I had to share it. So those in the UK will be most familiar with David, but let's get started. So David Anthony McGreavy was born on September 24th, 1951 in Southport, Lancashire, England. That's sort of in the middle, but on the west coast of England, with Liverpool kind of just to the south. So let's take a look at the history for that time to see, what possible stressors or environmental factors that might have affected his mother's pregnancy, because we cover the entire gamut here, my friends. So 1951 is the year that Elissa Kerrill, the bitch of Buchenwald, who I've also covered, was sentenced to prison. She had been a Nazi officer of sorts in the concentration camp at Buchenwald. She was not a good person. So go have a listen to that episode if you're curious. I'm working on a catalog, I promise. 1951 was also the year that Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin accused the United Nations of becoming, quote, a weapon of aggressive war. He also suggested that although a world war was not inevitable at the present time, warmongers in the West might trigger such conflict. Stalin's statement turned the tables by declaring that the United Nations was burying its moral prestige and dooming itself to disintegration. Why was he saying this? Hadn't World War II been over for 6 years? Well, yeah, but we were now actively fighting in the Korean War, another big news item for 1951. My grandfather's big brother went over there and fought in the Korean War, and from what I understood, he did not come back the same. In one of the most sensational trials in American history, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are convicted of espionage for their role in passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, and they were sentenced to death this year. The first nuclear testing occurred in Nevada in the United States in 1951. And random fun fact, the city of Paris in France celebrated its 2000th year in existence. That's actually kind of amazing that Paris is that old. J.D. Salinger's only full-length novel, The Catcher in the Rye, was published this year. That book would go on to hold a significant place in the true crime world, make no mistake. Other notable people born in 1951 are Angelica Houston, Phil Collins, our beloved and collectively adopted father, Robin Williams, Michael Keaton, Batman, Kurt Russell, the musician Sting, Mark Hamill, aka Luke Skywalker. There were a ton of notable people born this year. So it does feel like a lot was going on in the news. People were still trying to get over World War II, the Korean War, all the things. Could this have been a very stressful time in David's mother's life while she was pregnant? Well, it bears mentioning at least, right? Stress levels do affect a pregnancy. So his parents were Thomas and Bella McGreavy. Thomas was a military man, being a sergeant in the British Army. David was the second of 6 children. Due to Thomas being in the military, the family moved around a bit, as often happens in the military family sort of dynamic. And this family was no exception. They actually apparently moved all over the UK, but it was their stay in Germany that seemed to affect young David. His mother was interviewed after the crime, and she stated that he had seemed particularly comfortable and well during their stay in Germany. He and his siblings were said to have thrilled in the chance at getting to go and play in the woods and have the freedom to spread out and run, so to speak. And that is important for children. She also said that he had been just an average child and could remember no discipline issues or particular aggression, nothing. She said that he did once take money from her purse, but that had been the only issue she'd ever had. And of course, we can kind of grab an impulse control issue there, but if that's the only time, and that was just so he could take a trip into Liverpool, into the big city in his early teens. When he was 16 years old, he dropped out of high school to join the British Royal Navy with the full intention of making a career out of it, like his father had. And that is what I could find out about his childhood. Again, the UK has more strict privacy standards, and it can be a little bit more difficult to get a lot of detailed information. But just from what we know, we can begin to see a picture. 6 children is a lot of children. He was number 2, 4 more behind him. Sometimes this can leave kids feeling ignored or left out, unimportant, insecure. But I didn't see anything he did outwardly that would imply he felt that way. We know he and his siblings loved having the freedom to roam and play through the woods in Germany. I didn't hear about any specific sibling rivalry issues. But if we take a step back and look at it, he was the son of a career military man. Now, I didn't find really anything that said that he and his father had any level of strained relationship, or that David's father was particularly authoritarian in the home. But it would be hard to imagine that wouldn't be hard to imagine really, that Thomas would be rather picky about how things were conducted within the home. Perhaps there was, like a higher level of restriction when it came to normal childhood, or maybe there was some sibling sort of competitiveness for dad's favor. I'm just pondering. None of the sources I read said anything about there being any tension in the home, period. In fact, they all said that David had taken to having to move around perfectly fine. He didn't seem to have any adjustment issues at all. But their surprise in that is confusing me because he had a plethora of social interaction at home. Not just 1 or 2 siblings. He could have a different sibling nearly every day of the week. When your entire posse moves with you, then the adjustment would be at least minimized. I mean, not 100%, but you get it. It helps. His mother described him as average, so nothing he did really stood out. He wasn't hurting animals, that we know. He wasn't creeping on his siblings or anyone in the neighborhood. He wasn't a super genius at school, but he wasn't setting fires. He wasn't out saving Timmy from the well either. He was just living his day-to-day life like any normal child. The only thing we really have is the stolen money. I couldn't find his specific age when he did this, but it had to have been before he was 16. But old enough to not be scared to travel on his own, I guess, right? So probably 14, 15 years old is what I'm guessing. He wanted to travel into Liverpool, into the city. And I don't know if he asked for the money and was told no or what, but he took the money to get there, plain and simple. That's it. There's not a very good, obviously not a good thing to do, clearly, but I wouldn't even label him as displaying particularly antisocial behaviors. I'm not seeing that at all. None that I could find anyway. Now, if my UK loves want to share anything that I couldn't find, please always feel free to do so. This is our community, so let's use it. Let's talk. So I'm not seeing anything in this, admittedly small bit of information, of course, that indicates anything that might explain his later crimes. Nothing. All sources seem to agree that his childhood was fine, just fine. So we don't have a lot to work with here, but a theory that I will certainly address has come to my attention, so we'll get to that. So he joined the British Royal Navy at 16 years old in 1967, dropped out of school to do so. It was said that he had always intended to join the military and be a career military man, just like his pops, though his father had secretly doubted his son's determination. So when I read that, that was interesting. But join the Navy he did, right? His fellow officers and colleagues were later interviewed, and they reported that he was, kind of a bit of an ass. They described him as arrogant, cocky, always having to have the last word kind of person. And this attitude of his got him into trouble, kind of regularly. Apparently, he had been subjected to quite a few disciplinary procedures. Not good. And with this information, it becomes harder to believe that this behavior just sparked up out of nowhere. Where was this coming from if he had just been an average child, what happened? No head trauma? Nothing, really? His day-to-day military job, if you will, was working in the mess hall, the military cafeteria. I guess he had accidentally seen his name written in some petty officer's little notepad or something, and he thought they were going to have him change jobs. The exact reasons were not super clear to me, but whatever the reason, he saw his name written on something and it upset him, and so he began to drink. And his drinking began spilling into his daytime job, or if he were on watch. He was observed many times showing up to his post, agitated and drunk, in quotes. So very late one night, David broke into an officer's office and set fire to the trash can that had paper obviously in it. He tried to say that he accidentally dropped a cigarette butt in there and that started the fire. However, he allegedly was the one that sounded the alarm about the fire. But regardless, sources said the authorities, the investigators, no one believed his story. He was found guilty of negligence rather than arson, though, so there is that. 90 days detention and ordered to undergo psychological testing. And I love that. Way to go, Royal Navy. Unfortunately, his commanding officer never revealed the results of the testing, and his parents were given no explanation for his behavior. So from what I read to this day, that psychiatric report still isn't available to the public. Now, if any of you know otherwise, please feel free to share. Again, I would love to see it myself. So he serves his 90 days, right? Tries to go back to his military life. He was sent on a tour in the Far East. He came back to the UK, and in 1971, the now 20-year-old David met a woman named Mary. They sent letters back and forth at least twice a week, and it was said that David's letters were kind of beginning to get longer and longer, more intense, more pages. That April, he finally got to meet her. They hung out for a week, and then he proposed to her. But David's mother would later say that she did not approve of this relationship at all. And bless poor Mary, she was having a rough go of it in her life. Because according to Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, quote, Mary had some issues with her spine, and she was often in quite a lot of discomfort. If this condition wasn't treated, it could one day lead to her being paralyzed. But David's mother thought that Mary was a bit of a hypochondriac, that she was exaggerating. But David was absolutely besotted with Mary. Love that word. So his mother's words went unheeded. But the military had had enough of him, right? They had enough of his shit. They gave him the boot. He showed up on his parents' doorstep, mopey, nowhere to go. It had been his dream, or at least he had declared it his dream, to be a career military man again, like his father. And it was said that he felt like a failure. The drinking increased. He found odd jobs here and there, but would get fired for various reasons, and the drinking got pretty bad. The alcohol changed his personality completely. Sources all agreed. But even as he was fired from these jobs, he had thrown himself into this seemingly near obsessive relationship and engagement to Mary. He wanted a big and lavish wedding around Christmas in 1971. And Mary kept telling him that she didn't need all of that. And his intentions became a little more obsessive, and she ultimately called the relationship and the engagement off. So January 1972, he's 20 years old, kicked out of the Navy, living with his parents, no fiance, no job, no money. His parents told him, go find a job and help out around here. I mean, he was a grown man. It isn't unreasonable to ask that. And instead of accepting that and pitching in, apparently he sat around being an ass about it all. The self-pity party was strong. And his parents get sick of it, and so they tell him, you need to go, be gone, time to grow up. So David called upon a friend of his by the name of Clive Ralph, and Clive was happy to let him move into his and his wife, Elsie's, home with their 2 kids and one on the way. And for reference, every single source and everyone in the know back then all agreed that David was excellent with children. He had a natural grace and ease with them, the kind of patience that one loves to see, right? Their eldest child's name was Paul. When David came into their lives, Paul was just 3 years old. Their second child, Dawn, was not quite 2 years old. Elsie was pregnant with baby number 3. So Elsie said, quote, we lived in a cul-de-sac. Cul-de-sac is just a street that's kind of a dead end. There was about 10 houses in this cul-de-sac, and there was children in every house, and it was one of those places where everybody left their door open for anybody to come in and out, and everybody looked after everybody, end quote. She said that her husband Clive was working for his father as a truck driver, which is a lorry driver for the UK. David moved in, and he seemed to be a great help to Elsie, actually, with the kids. With Clive's job keeping him out on the road for long hours, well, it was nice to have an extra pair of hands. And David was just so incredibly good with the babies. It was even said that he paid a little for rent, but helped with chores and even cooked sometimes. I mean, fantastic. I'm lucky in that my lodger, who apparently calls himself my spouse, also cooks sometimes. But we love that. Elsie would later say that David got a job at a factory and life for him began to fall into some level of normalcy, except the drinking. He would day drink, get soused, and walk the white lines down the middle of the town road in an attempt to prove that he wasn't drunk. His parents didn't live far away, and it was said that his father scolded him for his behavior and told him, quit your frickin' drinking. Of course, he didn't listen, as many don't. Elsie gave birth to a baby girl in September of 72. Again, David stepped right up to the plate. Even the neighbors remarked on how sweet he was with those children. They thought he was a bit of a know-it-all, but admired him for the help he gave Elsie and the family as a whole. If Elsie had to, say, discipline the oldest child, Paul, David would be concerned about it. It was said that he would actually chastise Elsie if he felt that her discipline was a little too harsh. So this is where I want to mention something, though. I do not think this is true at all. I just wanted to throw it in because, I don't know. One source in particular, a book titled The Monster of Worcester, David McGreavy by Pamela Lillian Valmont, didn't just insinuate, but flat out said that Elsie and David became lovers. There was a whole narrative over there about how Elsie was nearly neglectful or abusive towards the children, and David would stand up to her. It was just one source, and I saw it nowhere else. So again, I don't think it's true, but to my UK people, if you know something, let us know. So time goes on, and the baby was now 6 months old, right? Clive's still driving, of course, and Elsie had decided to get a job at a local pub at night for some extra money to save up because they wanted to live in a bigger house. They were living in a 2-bedroom with David sharing a room with little Paul, everyone else in the other one. So clearly they needed more room. Again, things were going great. It was mutually beneficial. So on April 13th, 1973, which was a Friday the 13th, earlier that evening, David had gone to a pub to drink with a friend. He sat and drank what sources said 5 to 7 imperial pints, 2.8 to 4 liters of beer, which equates to a gallon of beer, plus or minus a little. He and his friend played cards and darts, but he angered his friend because David put his cigarette out in his friend's beer. Party foul. But David was a violent drunk, and his friend said it didn't lead to any kind of serious altercation. Clive then picked David up from the bar and took him home to watch the children while he went on down the road to pick up Elsie from work. He arrived and helped Elsie kind of close things up. I mean, one imagines a husband concerned about his wife working in a bar late at night and the drunks harassing her. That wasn't said, but it makes sense. He would have a beer himself, perhaps. The children were asleep. David was there just in case. Why not? But when they got home, the children and David were nowhere to be found. They contacted the police. It didn't take long for them to locate the children. And as Elsie and Clive tried to get past the officers to the location that they just knew their babies were, the officers would not allow the couple to pass. It was of no consequence, honestly. One cop getting sick to his stomach was plenty of information. So let me tell you what David did to those children. This involves the harming and ending, if you will, of children, and it's pretty intense, so I'm just warning you. So after Clive had dropped David off at the house to go get Elsie, sometime between 10:15 and 11:15 p.m., the now 9-month-old baby Samantha begins to cry. She wants her bottle so she can settle back down and go to sleep. She kept crying, and David was getting more and more angry at the fact that she wouldn't stop crying. He placed his hand over her mouth to shush her, then used his other hand to asphyxiate her. It didn't take long, and then he took her body into the bathroom, got a straight razor, and used it on her. He then used some instrument to strike her on the head, causing a compound fracture of her skull. That means the skin was opened and the bone possibly exposed. We're talking possible exposure of the brain to the outside environment. That was actually what ended her life, not the choking, if you will, not the razor. So she had endured that. He then went and got Dawn, the toddler, baby number 2, and he used the razor on her throat, if you will. He then went on to strangle Paul with some kind of wire. Paul was 4, and all 3 of these children who looked to him for comfort and care. Imagine the horror. And he wasn't done yet. It gets much worse. David then went and retrieved a pickaxe from the basement, and he used it to mutilate their little bodies even worse. Then David took all 3 little broken bodies and impaled them onto these spikes on top of a fence, like a wrought iron fence. Like you guys have seen The Walking Dead, right? Farm season. They have to save that guy whose leg is stuck on that fence in the dark, right? Those are not razor sharp. Just imagining the sheer force that it would take for him to be able to do that is so very disturbing. And he left them there. It was pitch black out. He left those babies on those spikes and walked away. This man, who had all but been nearly a second father to these children, who had nurtured them and loved them and was kind to them, get a bit of a drink in him and boom, an explosion of rage. He didn't just murder those children, he brutalized and mutilated them. In his drunken state, he didn't even make an attempt to conceal his crime. He left those babies on full display. So if they hadn't been found by morning, imagine what people on the street would have seen. Again, one officer got sick to his stomach from the sight of it. Elsie was not ever allowed to see her children in that state. Thank God. But David was finally located and arrested by police at about 3:50 in the morning, a few hours later, walking on a road 2 miles away from the house, trying to hitchhike out of town. At first, he denied any responsibility, but several hours later, he said, "It was me, but it wasn't me." After which he described in graphic detail what he had done to those children. He told police, quote, "I put my hand over Samantha's mouth and it went from there. It's all in the house. On Paul, I used a wire. I was going to bury him, but I couldn't. I went outside and I put them on the fence. All I could hear is kids, kids, kids." End quote. His only explanation for the murders was that the baby would not stop crying. He did plead guilty, which saved on a lot of court time and expense, and it was even said that he was in the courtroom no longer than 10 minutes in and out. He was sentenced to multiple life sentences with a minimum of 20 years. And as any of us can imagine, he was under constant threat in prison because a lot of people go to prison for whatever, and they are still good parents, all things considered, right? Child abusers and murderers don't tend to fare well in prison. So he had to be kept kind of in solitary, segregated from the other prisoners for his own safety. And then, remarkably, in December of 2018, a parole board cleared David for parole. They let him out of prison, stating he had regained self-control, was no longer a danger to society, and in June of 2019, the man known as the Monster of Worcester walked free, leaving many reeling at how this man could possibly have been set free. In fact, the outrage was so intense that he was nearly given a new identity, but that was quickly squashed. David is now 73 years old, and as far as I could find, he has not reoffended. So why? Why did he do this? For someone who had loved those children so much, why did this happen? Does being a heavy drinker cause legit personality changes? Well, alcohol can drastically and quickly alter some personalities. And while it doesn't cause major or noticeable shifts for everyone, some people can seem to completely be a different person compared to when they're sober. I mean, the alcohol affects the brain. It just makes sense. So, is there something missing that we didn't know about in his childhood? Some kind of behaviors? What do you guys think? What do you think's going on with him? Leave me a comment. DM me on Instagram at serial_killing, or join the Serial Killing, a Facebook fan page on Facebook. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.
Anybody who killed more than 2 or 3 people was a mass murderer, and whether it was all at one place or over an extended period of time. And then in the early 80s, they came up with this differentiation called serial killing.